recording. Here we go.
I think you should get the
And-
preamble.
And what?
I think you should record the preamble.
Record the preamble?
Yes, it's part of it.
Well, I'm just going to mute people so that there's no resonance, whatever feedback. Okay. And what we're going to do at the start is a little bit of science stuff, just partly as a review, but partly, a few new things. And then we're going to spend the bulk of the time on the book of Job and Jung's answer to the book of Job, which is some people think is the most religious that they've heard Jung. But then next classes we're going to continue with Jung and go into much more, real Jung. So that's what the agenda is for today. So let's see what we can do here for screen sharing. Here we go. So let's see, does this do it? This thing's in the way. Why is this thing? Well, we can, if this thing moves out of, no, it doesn't want to move out of the way. No, okay. So what we've got here, just to go back, is from working with Ron Cowan, it looks like we actually have a 26 real dimensional universe around us, but it's got some funny structure to it. So we live over here in a 10-dimensional subspace, but it's really, we only see 4 of the dimensions, length, breadth, width, and then the final one, time, is a little different. It's multiplied by the square root of -1 and the speed of light. So there's something funny about time. And then there are 6 other dimensions that we said are compactified there that are with us in this 10-dimensional space. And right next to us is another 10-dimensional space, which is for dark matter. Everything is mirrored for what we had for matter, except that things, the difference seems to be that all of the dimensions here are multiplied by the square root of -1. Again, don't ask me why, I'm just telling you this is what it looks like is going on. I have no idea where this comes from. And so we have this 10-dimensional space. Now, over here is where we saw the chakras or these mind forms were and they are inside each of us in these chakras. So over here in our space is our physical bodies. And finally, we have at the very bottom here this synchronizing set of 6 dimensions that sync up with the other 2 6-dimensional subspaces and make everything all in sync. So nothing anywhere gets out of sync, which is a real problem. You've got something that's complicated as this. So if we looked at this at any point that we're talking about, we need 26 numbers. 24 of them specify some sort of spatial dimension. And then we have 2, not 1, but 2 different numbers for time. One for in our matter space and one in our dark matter space. Okay. Now, what we saw was that there's holes in these compactified spaces. So if I have one hole connecting one dimension to another dimension, then if that hole does that, then there's really only one dimension there, because the hole links the 2 dimensions together. So we go from 2 dimensions to 1 dimension. So what we see here is you've got 3 holes in the matter subspace and 4 holes in the dark matter subspace, and they link to the 8 holes in the synchronizing subspace. So if I look at all these, it's really 3 takes care of 8 of the holes, 4 holes here takes care of 4 of these holes. That leaves 1 hole. I don't know where the other hole goes. It links to something, but the net of it is if I have 8 holes total in 18 dimensions, I've only got really 10 real dimensions to worry about here. Even though it looks like I've got 18, the holes link them all together. Now, the number 10 we've seen before. That's what we saw in Kalabah, where there were 10 Sephiroth in the tree of life. When we look at our in our abstraction on our Aleph Talks website, you'll see an abstraction there, which is the tree of life with 10 dimensions to it, 10 levels to it, all horizontally visualized, okay? Very different than the traditional tree of life. So that's one way to go play games with this thing. Now, there's a second way to go play games, and this one gets back to the notion of the Holy Trinity that arises again and again in Christianity. So let's see how this might work out. We've got these immortal entities here, these mind forms that make up this dark matter, and they link to everything. So they link through all of these different subspaces here that we've got here. Over here, let's just suppose we had a person, say Jesus of Nazareth, okay? So Jesus of Nazareth has a soul. Well, the soul is made up of these entities in these dark matter, these mind forms that are in his different chakras. But what happens here is that remember there's 10 of these levels here, and at the very top, if you think of turning this picture around up here with the synchronization, that's the highest level that you could get to. And I'm asking myself, what would this mean? Well, this would probably mean that up here in the interactions with these mind forms is the highest levels of thought here. So this could very well be the Father is up here in these highest dimensions. The Son is over here in the matter dimensions, linked to it, and the Holy Spirit is linked over here in these dimensions. So I got 1, 2, 3 coming around here. And this is simply using different words to describe this Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But they're actually all linked together. They're really one common 10-dimensional subspace. So that's our little digression for tonight on doing this sort of stuff. Now, what am I going to do is take us back. I'm going to get out of this. I'm going to take us back to what we touched on before, which was we listened to Mike Levin at Tufts, and he was talking about dealing with this bioelectric field that is in our bodies, and how this would allow you to regenerate things, to refresh your body cells, to make them want to come back to their more natural state, which is all fine. Just a sec, I lost something here. What he was thinking of doing is simply one approach to doing these sorts of things. That is oh my God, I see what happened. Here it is. I got it now. Okay, now we're okay. There's a different approach to this. There's a lot of work right now in what's called longevity. This is driven by the basic statistic that the leading cause of death is death. And so people wonder, well, what can we do? Is there some way to treat this? So Michael Levin is proposing one set of tools, which is to somehow stimulate this electric field that's in our cells to bring us around to prolonging, regenerating the cells, and therefore keeping us alive longer. But there's other approaches that are being exposed now. And I'm just going to give you a different one right now, which is based on what's called epigenetics. So we're familiar with genetics, and in genetics we have the DNA and RNA that are made up of these 4 basic amino acids. Having said all that, there's something called an epigenome, as opposed to the epi comes about from interactions of the genome with the world around you. So people have now realized that there's nature and there's nurture, and nature implies that you end up intrinsically having the set of genes given to you, and that's going to determine how long you live. But the nurturing side of things can also impact how long you live. If you know, for example, if you smoke a lot, or you're significantly overweight, or eat a lot of things with sugar in it, there's a lot of statistical evidence that you won't live as long. And so the question is, if we look at this epigenetic side of things, what can we do to prolong life? And that's what we're going to look at here. So this is a second guy, David Sinclair, who's at Harvard, and you can judge for yourself. Here's a little view of what's happening in modern biology.
So I stand here as a representative of a field called aging science, longevity science. Some people call it anti-aging. We don't use that as scientists. But what has happened in the last 25 years
Can
is nothing
everybody hear?
short of revolutionary. And thank goodness I come from Harvard Medical School. Well, what I'm going to tell you tonight, you would find extremely difficult to believe is true. I'm on record saying that the first person to live to 150 years has already been born. And I said that about 5 years ago. And in the last 5 years, something extraordinary has happened since, making me think that it's not just 150 years, all bets are off. And that's not just for somebody who's born today, who will live definitely into the 22nd century, where the technologies that they'll have, we can barely even imagine. Even 10 years from now, we can barely imagine. But those of us who were born in the 1960s, like I was, 1970s, 80s, and even those who are now just in their 20s, will benefit from this real major advance that I'm going to tell you about today. This is also personal. It's not just about technology. In my family, I was raised by my grandmother predominantly. My mother also helped. She was working. But my grandmother escaped Europe in the 1950s, having lived through, as a young girl, the Depression, World War II. She was from Hungary. It was a brutal time. She escaped to Australia, where I got my accent, and I came to MIT in my 20s. But she raised me to believe that humans could do better than we've done in the 20th century. And she said it's partly my role to show humanity can be better than they are. And that's what drives me every day I get up. And my goal since I was really 4 years old was to try and leave the world a better place. And in my teens, late teens, in college, I thought, well, there's this thing that happens to everybody called aging, and it's 90% of all the sickness and suffering in the world, but no one seems to care about it. You go to your doctor and they say, yeah, that's normal. You're old, you should be getting sick. And I said, that's not right. At any age, we should apply the same technology, the same effort to make people live as long as they possibly can. We fought against cancer, we fought against heart disease, we're fighting against Alzheimer's disease. What about aging? And I refuse to believe that just because this is natural and common, that we should regard it as something different from a disease. In my view, in my world, aging is a medical condition. So you see behind me an image of my father, who, of course, is the son of my grandmother who raised me. My grandmother lived a very different life than my father. My grandmother smoked, drank, did pretty much everything that was not going to slow down the aging process. She died, like a lot of people do, who lived through the 20th century, in a frail state, demented, slow decline. It was very painful for her, and certainly painful for us as a family to watch. My father, on the other hand, has watched the science come out of this field and done the right things that we'll talk about later. So at 82, he started a new career. He's thriving. He's looking forward to the next 20 years of his life, if not longer. This is what I want for everybody. We can all do this if we just know the facts and don't pay attention to 99% of what's out there on the internet, because it's all wrong. Speaking of wrong, we have a new theory of aging. We used to think that antioxidants were the cure to aging. And if you go to the supermarket, you'll still get a lot of that bull. It's not true. Antioxidants have been really unsuccessful at lengthening the lifespan of anything, even a worm. It doesn't work that well. The reason is that there's much more going on than just free radical damage. What we need to do is to tap into our body's natural defenses against aging. We have three main sets of defenses. One's called mTOR, responds to fasting. One called AMPK responds to low energy and lack of sugar. You want to keep your blood sugar levels low as possible without fainting. And the group of genes that I work on are called the sirtuins, and they respond to all of the things that we do, the adversity, the exercise, the fasting. And this group of genes and these proteins that the genes make sense the environment. And when times are thought to be tough and could threaten us, they fight harder to keep our body safe, protected, and ultimately healthier and longer lived even late in life. And what they're doing, these sirtuins, is controlling this structure here. They're doing a lot of things, I should say, but the main thing that I believe they're doing to make us live longer is controlling what we call the epigenome. If you haven't heard of the epigenome, think of it like this. We have DNA. I'm showing you it as a blue strand. It's digital information, ATCG. There's 4 bases. It's base 4. It's not base 2 or binary. The epigenome is not digital. It's mostly analog. And anyone who's old enough to have had an analog device, whether it's a tape recorder, a record player, a record, these things get disrupted. They get scratched. It's very bad, very poor at copying information. And that's true for the epigenome as well. Copying epigenetic information doesn't work that well. What is the epigenome? It's the structures that wrap up the DNA and say that this gene A should be on in a brain cell, but in a liver cell should be off. And this gene B should be off in a skin cell, but should be on in a kidney. That's the epigenome. And largely it's due to the 3-dimensional structures of the folding of DNA. And these sirtuins that defend us are called silent information regulators. That's what sirtuins actually stand for, SIR. And 2 is the number 2 for the first gene in yeast that we showed extended lifespan way back in Lenny Garanti's lab at MIT in the 1990s. But here's the analogy, that the DNA is the digital information on a compact disc. Those of us who are old enough know what that is. For the youngsters, this is what we used to store 20 songs on. It was great technology. That's your genome, the digital information. The epigenome is the reader, and it can read different songs depending on different parts of the body and different cell types. But what I believe is causing aging is the skipping of those songs, skipping of the reader. And what makes songs skip? Scratches. So aging is essentially scratches on a compact disc that makes the music skip. And eventually cells, by reading the wrong genes, skipping the wrong genes, lose their ability to fight against disease. They lose their function. We get dementia, we get heart disease, we get cancer, we get frailty. That is aging. So with this new theory of what I call the information theory of aging, we can perhaps test this by testing if epigenetic changes cause aging. And if that's true, is it possible to reset these structures back to being young? Is there a backup copy of the epigenome? In other words, can you polish that CD and get back the original music value? Before I go on, I want to point out, in this structure, there's something really important. It's not just the proteins that wrap up the DNA, but the modifications that are on the DNA itself. Chemical additions called methyls. Methyls are carbons with 3 hydrogens. They're very simple. And cells add them as we're developing in the womb to say, all right, that cell that's come from a stem cell should be a neuron for 80, 90, 100 years in the brain. And this one should be a skin cell. These marks called methyls dictate the production of 26 billion cells that many of them have different functions in the body, even though they have the same set of instructions encoded in the DNA. What's been found since 2013, Stephen Horvath and his colleagues discovered that by reading the changes over time of these DNA methylation marks on the DNA that are attached to the letter C in the DNA, not the A, T, or G, you can estimate somebody's biological age because it's reproducible. We're all aging due to the same mechanisms, and that there's a pattern that occurs from conception very rapidly until we're born, and then slows down, and then is linear throughout our lifespan. We can measure that clock. I can take your blood, I can take your skin, any part of your body, and I can run that through what's called a DNA sequencer, measure the methylation, there's thousands of them, and putting that into a machine learning derived algorithm, I can tell you your actual real age, not your chronological age. I mean, birthdays, who cares? Number of times the Earth's gone around the sun, you kidding me? That's not your real age. What your real age is there's changes to the epigenome that determine how old you really are. So the question is, if we tweak the epigenome, if we scratch that CD, if I'm right about the information theory of aging, what do we get? We'll get accelerated aging. This is a mouse that's the control in my lab. So we tweaked this mouse in every other way except scratch its CD. At the same time, we took a sibling born at the same time, and we, for 3 weeks, accelerated the scratches on the CD. We disrupted its epigenome, and the cells started to lose their identity. The mouse didn't feel it. It's like getting an X-ray, you don't feel that. But what happened 10 months later was we got an old mouse. This isn't just a mouse that looks old. This mouse is literally 50% older than its sibling, even though it's genetically identical. These are twins born at the same time. One is old and one is not. We can drive aging as fast as we want forwards. Then the question is, if you can give something, can you take it away? And if I'm right, the answer is yes. First of all, let me show you about a minor tweak to age reversal. We found these sirtuins can defend against aging, but they can also reverse aspects. If we activate them, either giving them molecules from the plant world that plants produce when they want to slow down their aging process and survive, we call these xenohermetins. We have drugs that have been in development. We have more that are coming. We have one in particular that's of interest, and it's called an NAD booster. NAD is a fuel for the sirtuins, whereas resveratrol is the accelerator pedal. So giving the fuel to these mice, I'll show you what happens. One of these mice has been on the sirtuin activating molecule called NMN, nicotinamide mononucleotide. And hopefully you can guess which of these mice has been rejuvenated from an old state. These are really old mice. They're almost 2 years of age, and only one of them has been drinking NMN in the water. And if you pick the mouse on the right, you'd be wrong. It's the mouse on the left, obviously, and we have published in the journal Cell in 2018 that this is possible to rejuvenate the cardiovascular system of mice and make it younger through the sirtuins. And we know it's working through the sirtuins because if we delete those genes, you don't get this effect on these mice here. But that was just the beginning. That's 2018. We're now in a world where our technology makes this pale by comparison. We now have the ability to reset the age of an entire animal, leading to one day being able to reset the entire age of our bodies. What did we do? We really stood on the shoulders of a scientist, Shinya Yamanaka, who won the Nobel Prize in 2016 for discovering a set of embryonic genes that could take an adult cell, a skin cell from any of you, and turn it into a pluripotent stem cell that could be made into any other type of tissue. And we can do that in the lab. High school students can do this by putting in the 6 Yamanaka genes. Now, we found that if you put in a subset of 3 of them, OCT4, SOX2, and KLF4, short for OSK, we could take the age of the body of a mouse backwards, but not so far that it would become a stem cell or a tumor. This was published in December 2020. It made the cover of Nature magazine, and the title on the magazine was Turning Back Time. This is one of the pieces of data from that paper. We did 3 things. The first was to damage an optic nerve in a mouse. And you can see on the top image that the crushed nerve is dying. That orange stain should extend all the way to the brain on the left. But in the reprogrammed eye, where we injected those 3 genes and turned them on for 3 weeks, we could make those neurons grow back. We measured those neurons, and they were literally half the age that they were 3 weeks ago. And young nerves, as you might know, grow back. Adult nerves do not. So this was the first indication that we were on the right track. We also could see that those structures, that epigenome, those scratches on the CD, they went away. We can also grow human tissue in the lab. We don't know yet if this works in humans, but we can model it in the dish. These are human pluripotent stem cells that have been engineered into little mini brains. On the left of this image, you can see these are little organoids. These are quite similar to human brains. They have electrical activity. And on the right is the electrodes that we put the brains on. We can measure that. We think they dream, they have thoughts, and we can also age them using our technology of disrupting the epigenome. And now we've shown that if you reset the age of those little brains, they get their ability to think again. The electrical activity comes back. Does this mean one day if we reverse the age of the brain, you'll get your memory back? Possibly. We've done this now in mice. Old mice, we can rejuvenate their brain, take their brains back to half their age, and they get their ability to learn again. So you might say, well, this sounds great, but how long is this going to be before we have it? And my hope is that we're at a turning point in human history, as important as flight and Silicon Valley and energy and crypto. The 22nd century is going to be about biology and the ability to control your age and the rate of aging and slow down not just body aging and heart aging, but even brain aging with these tools and age reversal tools that are just coming along will radically change the arc of our lives in a way that we can barely even imagine. And when we can reset our age by a couple of years, which has now been published, that's been done by Greg Fahey and colleagues. If we do that every year, even just set your age back 1 year every year, what happens, right? Things then get really interesting. And that's the world that we have to stay alive to be able to witness. And if we all do the right things, we will witness that. Thank you very much.
So there you have David Sinclair. He wrote a book called Lifespan that I have read. You can get it on Amazon. And he talks the sirtuins that he talked about that he's trying to stimulate.
At my house, I welcome the temptation
Oops,
of
hold on,
to sneak a
one
peek
sec.
into my bathroom medicine cabinet, because
That's what I
inside
love about this.
I thought that was you gargling, Marjorie.
I have a bottle.
Hold on.
I'm just sneezing.
I think, let's see, I'm just trying to get out of this thing. Here we go. Finally.
And I unmuted just to ask a quick question. How is this, how is the product introduced into the mouse in order for the reversal to occur?
Yeah, so that's what I was going to get to. What he was arguing for to stimulate this is you should take every day some resveratrol, which is an extract of red wine. And there's a lot of evidence that red wine prolongs life. There's this NMN, Nancy Mary Nancy entity that he says, and then finally,
Bart is taking that.
and then there's a final thing, which is a drug for counteracting diabetes. Okay, the commercial version of it is the non-prescription version of it is Baranine, and there is a prescription version as well. But he's recommending taking each of these that I just mentioned: the resveratrol, the NMN, and the diabetic drug, taking them every day. And so I've been doing that for several years. And Marjorie tells me that both hairs that I have are slowly getting darker, maybe. But anyway.
Oh, his beard is darker. The hair on his head is darker.
The eyebrows, yeah. So, you know, we'll see what happens. He talked about his father. So his father has been doing this for 10 years. When he got to be 80, and when he was 80, he went, that picture was of his father zip lining, okay, in some park someplace. And he's off on a second career for 20 years. So we'll see what happens. One of the problems with all this stuff is the only way to really know what's going on is you have to wait for people to die. So it takes a while to figure out if it really works. But there's probably something there. I think there's probably something with what Michael Levin is doing at Tufts. And then there's other people as well that are poking at this in other ways. I just wanted to show you an example of, again, it's almost mystical how this has been coming about. But if you read in the Bible, you would see that in Genesis that there are all of these people that live for 900 years, and a lot of people just dismiss that as rubbish. That someone was, maybe they meant 900 months, not 900 years. Well, maybe what really was 900 years. Who knows what was going on? So that's the thing to keep in mind. All of this is on the website, so you can dig it out. And that is our little science bit. So now we're going to go off. I want to pick up on something that Bruce was nice enough to send. Let me just dig it out here.
If anybody has anything
Is there any questions on any of this stuff before we go off, and
or comments?
comments, you name it?
Just to qualify that the conversations I've had with some of the old timers about the Bible is that the numbers were the one thing that anybody could question without a lot of negative feedback. 40 was really old. in Jesus' time. So if you live to be 90, you know, that was like 900 to him. So I'm not saying that that is a fact. I'm just saying that, you know, I have reservations about people living to be 900.
No, I understand. We'll see. I just flagged that as something that was there. You know, I mean, one of the reasons why, you know, you have to watch some of these statements, the fact that the lifetime was like 40 years or 50 years was because of the infant mortality, but it didn't mean that people didn't live to be 70, 80, 90, 100. It's just that there weren't a lot of them. And the averages, you know, pulled it way back down.
Well, they say our teeth are designed to last for about 40 years.
Yeah,
Seems like the truth.
yeah, I believe it. So we're going to push on here and go off into Jung. And so Bruce Cowan was nice enough to write up a little thing here. Bruce, do you want to read this? You want me to read it? You tell me. Do we lose Bruce?
Well, you can read it. I'm just trying to think of a way to explain it a little bit better.
Okay, let me read it, and then you chime in when we finish. Then.
Okay.
Okay, so here's what is going on. There's a stage in meditation where you hate God. I didn't experience this because I didn't really believe in God in the first place. But I've talked to others who have or were angry at those who believed in God. The realization of no self can happen slowly. You can realize you don't have a self and not know it. The problem with believing in God is that it reinforces conceit. If you believe there is someone outside of you that is superior to you, you automatically think you can be superior to someone else. But this disappears when your self disappears. So hate can happen towards God or those who believe in God. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. It has to go back to the how you realize that you do not have a self. To start off, you don't see that you have a self, because in normal life, you think you're normal, and but in fact you have a self. So when you meditate a lot and do a lot of practice, what happens is that your own deeper mind gradually starts to dissolve the self. And the self can actually disappear, and you don't even know that it's happened. Because when you don't have a self, it feels entirely normal until you start noticing things. So if this didn't apply to me, because I didn't really believe in God that much at all when I was in youth. But if you do, you take it on and you believe in God, you think it's normal to have conceit. Think everyone has conceit, so it's normal, right? But when you have a realization of no self, the self disappears. You don't even know it, but the actual conceit disappears. One of the problems with having a self is there's subject object. There's already subject, subject because there's a self, and the object is everyone else. And you think that's normal. And that allows conceit to arise. And what happens is that you're meditating along and you're progressing, and you reach a point where the self actually has disappeared. It's actually not there, but you have no idea that's true. And then you find you have anger towards the idea of God, because when there's no self, God doesn't exist. It's not a reality in the mind at all. But you don't even know it because you don't realize the self is gone. So I think my teacher, Namche Rinpoche, sort of said this in tongue in cheek. You know, have you reached a stage where you hate God? Is actually when you start to realize you have no self. The problem with believing in God is that you think conceit is reality. Because you have a God outside of you, not inside of you, it's not experiencing your own mind, but it's outside of you. Something's wrong.
Right.
You already have the realization that God does not exist. Yourself doesn't exist anymore. And so you have anger towards people who believe in God because they have strong conceit. Or if you think about God and it doesn't make sense, so anger can arise. So that's just a stage of meditation where understanding of God sort of disappears.
Right.
Does that
So
help?
that's why we're going now into the book of Job, and again, this is where God is present, but we also have evil as shown by an entity called Satan or the devil or whatever. And so this is a totally different take on what Bruce just said. That we'll see where it leads. And I'm going to give this a try, and we'll see what happens here. Oops.
In the land of Uz, there lived a man named Job. Job was a near perfect man. Not only did he have a loving family and wealth befitting a king, he was a man who loved and served God. His humility and piety were unmatched by any human. His virtuousness was so incomparably great that even the rulers of heaven and hell took notice. The devil, Satan, met with God to discuss Job's righteousness. Satan argues that Job only loves and praises God because he is so blessed. If Job were to lose his family and all his possessions, he would surely curse God. Upon hearing this, the Lord said to Satan, "Very well, then everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger." Thus, Satan proceeds to take away all of Job's wealth, all of his animals, and all of his servants. Worst of all, he murders his sons and daughters. And to top everything off, Job's skin is afflicted with boils, which he scratches at with pieces of broken pottery. As Job wallows in his suffering, his wife and his friends do nothing to help comfort him. Rather, they enhance his misery. His friends speculate that Job must have done something sinful to invite this level of divine torment. Yet Job knows, just as the reader knows, that he has done nothing wrong. He clings to his morality, even continuing to worship God and pray to him in his miserable state. This behavior confounds Job's wife, who says the following: "Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die." The temptation to curse God is obviously present. I imagine most people in Job's situation would be corrupted by this level of unearned suffering. Though we witness Job's struggle with temptation, he nonetheless holds fast to his love for God. Having said that, though, the pain he feels is of such intensity that he cannot help but desire an explanation. Job wishes to appeal to God, the supposed supreme judge, in the hopes that he might hear Job's case. Job knows he has done nothing wrong. He has lived by God's moral strictures, and he continues to provide the appropriate praise and sacrifices that God demands, despite his emaciated, sickly, and poverty-stricken state. If Job can be accused of anything wrong, it is his belief that he can appeal to divine justice. But given his state, would we not view this desire to be more than forgivable? Well, in the eyes of God, apparently not. God appears before Job in the form of a whirlwind. Instead of offering an explanation for Job's suffering, God criticizes Job for his single transgression. God criticizes Job for his littleness and his ignorance. Quote, "Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge?" Contrasted with a divine being who is all-powerful and all-knowing, Job was like a mouse who caught the gaze of a lion. God then proceeds to flaunt his power before Job through a series of visions. During these visions, God asks where Job was when he laid the foundations of the earth. God asks him if he knows when the mountain goats give birth. God asks him who gave the horse its strength, among many other questions whose answers point to God's unquestionable authority. When God finished his lengthy display of power, he asks Job if he, in his measly mortal state, is capable of understanding the functions of the universe, let alone controlling it. Job then proceeds to respond, quote, "My ears have heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes." Though Job's appeal was clearly rejected, something strange happens at the end of the story. In an almost abrupt fashion, Job's health and wealth had been restored to him twice over. Job went on to live 140 years, seeing his children and their children to the fourth generation. Growing up as a Christian, I was told that the book of Job served as an explanation for why bad things happen to good people. God's status as an all-knowing, all-powerful being, as the supreme arbiter of justice, suggests that there is a transcendent purpose to every event in our lives. Even when some events don't seem fair or just, they all have an ultimate meaning that we must see through to the end, and we only get there by living in accordance with God's will. Though I accepted this explanation for a large part of my life, I accepted it with difficulty. I'm sure even the most ardent Christians in my audience can sympathize with this feeling, especially those who have had their faith tested when they confronted immense suffering. I certainly fell into that category. I have experienced great suffering, not just in my own life, but in the lives of people I know and people I don't know. No matter how much I tried to put my faith in God, my mind tortured me relentlessly with this desire for knowledge, for a purpose behind this immense suffering. I couldn't resist it, and seeking an explanation for seemingly pointless suffering, and seeking an explanation for God's actions in the book of Job, I came across Carl Jung.
Jung believed that Job actually had the moral upper hand in that description because God behaved rather reprehensibly in having a bet with the devil. And Jung wrote a book called Answer to Job, which is very much worth reading. It's quite a profound piece of work.
With Answer to Job, Jung provided that explanation which I had sought out for so long. He not only gave a logical explanation for God's behavior, but he did it in a way that vindicated Job, in a way that made him the moral superior of that story. I know such a suggestion might seem blasphemous to Christians and even incomprehensible to atheists. After all, how can a human being be more righteous than the Almighty? In order to explain, I must first provide Jung's criticisms of God in the book of Job. When I've done that, I will then be able to provide Jung's explanation of God's behavior in the clearest way possible. Let us start back at the beginning of the story when God is speaking with Satan. Christian doctrine states that one should resist the devil at every opportunity. So why doesn't God do the same? In order to set a good example, shouldn't the Lord ignore Satan and cast him out of heaven? After all, Jesus said God, his Father, cast Satan out of heaven once in Luke 10:18. What's stopping him from doing it again? Worst of all, God allows Satan to sow doubt within his mind, which should be an impossibility. I mean, think about it. If God is an all-knowing being, if he is omniscient, wouldn't he be able to consult with his omniscience and remove any doubt he had towards his faithful servant? If he did, wouldn't this little experiment on Job be entirely unnecessary? By the way, this isn't the first time where God's status as an all-knowing being is called into question. For example, in Genesis 6:6, God expresses regret for having created human beings on account of their wickedness. If he was truly an all-knowing being, wouldn't he have known that humanity would inevitably become a thoroughly sinful race? Keep this question in mind because we will return to it later on. Jung goes on to point out that God, arguably, violated 2 of the 10 commandments which he presented to Moses on Mount Sinai. One commandment was, "Thou shalt not kill," and the other was, "Thou shalt not steal." God is part of a conspiracy to commit murder when he permits Satan to kill Job's servants and his children. He is also a part of the conspiracy to commit theft when Satan steals all of Job's possessions. Granted, one could point out that Job had his wealth paid back to him 2 times over at the end of the story. But what of his dearly loved sons and daughters? Surely the trauma he experienced from their loss would follow him to the end of his days. As Jung sarcastically points out, children are not so easily replaced by new and better models. Again, if God had consulted his omniscience, this orchestration of murder and theft would have been completely unnecessary. Let us not overlook the fact that when it comes to systems of morality, all parties who agree to that system are expected to abide by the same rules. In regards to the 10 Commandments, isn't it reasonable to view them as a sort of legal covenant between God and mankind, and that anyone who is party to this contract could insist on his rights as agreed? That God would be faithful and true, or at least just, and as one could assume from the 10 Commandments, would have some recognition of ethical values, or at least feel committed to his own legal standpoint. Basically, what Jung is trying to ask is whether or not God is permitted to act outside of the rules that he established. If he is, why should human beings follow him? Let's move on from God's omniscience to his omnipotence, his status as an all-powerful being. Surely, the pious Job, whose entire world has been turned upside down by God, is fully aware of God's omnipotence. He already knows that the only being that is permitting all these tragedies to happen is God. Surely, God should know this if he's the all-knowing being that he says he is. So why does God feel the need to flaunt his might before Job? To quote Jung, "Is it worth the lion's while to terrify a mouse?" Finally, Jung acknowledges a common argument made in favor of God's behavior in the book of Job. Maybe, in God's omniscience, he knew that Job would ultimately succeed, that his continual worship of God, despite his suffering, would exalt him as a higher moral being. In response to this criticism, Jung says that God's behavior remains even more illogical and incomprehensible, as he could then have enlightened Job on this point, which in view of the wrong done to him would have been only fair and equitable. But God does not do this. Instead, he almost frightens Job to death because he dared to have an opinion about the whole situation. Again, that was arguably the only wrong thing that Job ever did. Aside from that, he was God's most cherished servant on account of his morality. Now, when we consider all of these criticisms, a possible conclusion one might make is that the Judeo-Christian God is not the all-knowing being that he says he is. Some might go as far as to suggest that the Gnostic Christians were right in labeling the true ruler of this earth as a malevolent demiurge. However, Jung puts forward an explanation that, surprisingly, validates God's status as an all-knowing being, despite the fact that God did not consult his omniscience in the book of Job. Allow me to explain how this is possible. One of the first things you will learn as a Christian is that God is 3 things. He is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent. It is these 3 qualities that enabled God to not only create the universe, but enabled him to know how it all functions, and enabled him to be in every place at every time. One could assume, as many theologians have, that if all creation sprang from God, that God is everything in its totality. He is as eternal and pervasive as the cosmos. From this, we can also logically deduce that God is immortal. Now, if God is immortal, as well as being everything in its totality, it is arguable that God is limitless. There is no place that he isn't. There is no power he doesn't possess. He is everything. Paradoxically, though God contains everything within him, the one thing he doesn't contain is limits. By contrast, Job and the rest of mankind are limited. God lacks the human limitation of mortality. This is important because it is in mankind's limitations that Jung begins to explain God's actions towards Job. Quote, "What does man possess that God does not have? Because of his littleness, puniness, and defenselessness against the Almighty, he possesses a somewhat keener consciousness based on self-reflection. He must, in order to survive, always be mindful of his impotence. Because human beings are always at the mercy of their mortality, they need to self-reflect in order to avoid suffering and death. If they remained unconscious of what was causing them pain, they would surely die. God does not need to self-reflect because he is immortal. He will never die. Thus, human morality differs from God's morality because humans are mortal and God is immortal. The morality of human beings hinges on their ability to act morally in the face of immense suffering, just as Job did. In the case of Job, it was by continuing to act morally in the face of the worst possible suffering that he developed, to use Jung's words, a more concentrated light than God possesses. It is here that Jung begins to explain God's behavior. It is because Job continues to be faithful and loving towards God despite his suffering that he develops a form of morality that transcends the Almighty. Due to this, God retaliates out of jealousy. This is in keeping with how we have seen God act up until this point in the Bible. God even admits to being jealous in the past, so why not be jealous in this respect? But that begs the question, why be jealous at all? Why wouldn't a supposedly loving God, who supposedly already has everything, embrace Job for his righteousness? Let's look at this from a psychological perspective. When you feel jealous of somebody, it is because that other person possesses something that you don't have. If a moral person were to feel jealous, they might ask themselves what it is that they personally lack that is preventing them from obtaining what they crave. For example, I don't have that man's expensive TV because I don't work as hard as he does. To use Jung's words, a moral person would self-reflect. They have to. If they don't, they'll continue to fall to the predations of jealousy. Ideally, after this period of self-reflection, they would become conscious of that which they lack. Unlike a human being, God has never had to self-reflect or become conscious of anything because he already is everything. If God has never had to become conscious of anything, then the only logical conclusion one could make is that God is unconscious. Not only that, he acts unconsciously. If this is true, this would explain a lot of things. It would render God's actions in the book of Job completely amoral, neither good nor bad, because they were done without conscious intent. Moreover, it explains how God is able to possess omniscience, but never uses it. It is because he lacks the conscious ability to access it. Also, remember when I brought up God expressing regret about creating humanity and how that contradicted his omniscience? Jung argues that if God is already everything in its totality, and that totality rests in an unconscious mind, then God's expression of regret makes sense. Quote, "From the way the divine nature expresses itself, we can see that individual qualities are not adequately related to one another, with the result that they fall apart into mutually contradictory acts. For instance, Yahweh regrets having created human beings, although in his omniscience, he must have known all along what would happen to them. In Jung's mind, God never had to self-reflect until his encounter with Job. He never had to be conscious of anything until that moment. God tried to avoid this moment of consciousness in the same way humans do. When one becomes conscious of a personal weakness, it is a painful experience. We will do everything that we can to not become conscious of that weakness. God did the same thing. He tried to avoid that painful conscious realization with a display of force. Unfortunately, even if you're God, might does not trump right. The idea of an unconscious God who is everything in its totality presents terrifying implications, especially for the Christian religion. Just like other Christians, I was brought up to believe that the Christian God was, to use a Latin phrase, the summum bonum, that God was the sum of everything that was good and nothing that was evil. If God is the universe in its totality and is an unconscious God, that would render him an antinomy, a totality of inner opposites. Neither good nor evil, God would unconsciously be both. There are many arguments that Jung makes in favor of this new conceptualization of God. In the next video, I will focus on the psychological arguments made in favor of God as an antinomy. After that, I will present the evidence that Jung cites from scripture. Until then, please make sure to hit that like button if you liked this video. Also, if you are enjoying these videos so far, please consider supporting me on Patreon.
Okay, so we're going to go to the next video, but any comments or questions? I would like to point out that it's, again, what Jung is saying is that there isn't some sort of white male with a long beard wearing a robe up on a throne someplace, that instead it's this unconscious entity. And I would just observe that this physics view of things, of these compactified dimensions where they have the information that controls the algorithms for all the forces and particles that are in the universe. And so those algorithms run as they do. Well, that sure sounds like it's unconscious to me. Of course, who created the algorithms? That's another story, which we're going to.
So actually, I do have a question and a comment.
Go ahead.
That I hope is stimulative as well to other additional conversation. But if you think of unconsciousness as lack of awareness, I would argue that God is not unaware, and that Job was not the first time that he became aware. I mean, Adam and Eve, he was very aware of the working with the snake and banishing out. There was Noah, the 4 warnings.
Right.
There was Moses, the tablets. It's kind of, maybe the constant state is not consciousness rather than unconsciousness, but at important points becoming aware that God needs to intercede. That's just my comment.
Something that I think might be helpful is the way we refer to God in Kabbalah class. It was the oneness. We called it the oneness because you're moving away from this personification, this he, that knows all. But it's the question, well, how can the oneness know itself without some separation? And that's what starts the whole creative process, is that the story of the Simpson, where God contracts part of himself out of the absolute oneness in order to have the
Because I'm sorry, go ahead.
You were breaking up. We couldn't hear what you said.
I was just saying that I understand the oneness and the everything, but even getting back to the physics where, a point can also be seen at a different point on a plane at the same time. There are times that awareness does occur, even though everything is permeated. I'm probably not being very clear in my statements, but my thoughts are clear to me.
So
I would say it can.
Wait,
but
Bud
it
wants to
doesn't-
say something.
But I don't know if it does necessarily.
Go ahead, Bud.
So God knew that Job was going to pass the test. God had to believe that Job was going to pass the test, because if he didn't, then God would cease to exist, and so would Satan. B, God is a transcendent, and as soon as we leave the transcendent, we end up, as Marge was just saying, the transcendent is oneness, and we are all one. As soon as we leave that transcendent, the consciousness of the transcendent, we end up in the world of polarities, good and evil, black and white, male and female, etc.
Good. I think some of this is going to be addressed in the next video. So let me, I don't mean to be rude. I just want to take us there. We'll see what it has to say.
There's 3 parts.
There's actually 4 videos.
Okay. But 3 is this, right?
Yeah, 3 in this series.
In the last video, I established Carl Jung's 2 primary arguments regarding what he believes is the true nature of the Christian God. In the simplest terms, Jung believes the Christian God is unconscious, and that he is also a totality, a unity of all opposites. He is not an exclusively good God, as many Christians are educated to believe, neither is he an exclusively bad God. To Jung, God is amoral, in that he is neither good nor bad. For one cannot act morally or immorally if one is unconscious, nor can one act morally or immorally if they are everything good and everything bad at once. With that established, I can now begin to provide more evidence in favor of Jung's theses. For this video, I'll be providing the psychological evidence. Much of the evidence I am about to cite will be from a book by a Jungian scholar named Edward Edinger, a book called Transformation of the God Image. This book is an extensive commentary on Answer to Job and its psychological implications. Before I can cite the psychological evidence for you, I need to establish 2 of Jung's most famous psychological theories. One is arguably his most famous concept, the collective unconscious, and the other is less famous, but certainly no less important, the self. If you happened to watch my Ion series or watch my videos regularly, then you might already have a decent understanding of these 2 concepts. In that case, feel free to skip to this point in the video. Starting with the collective unconscious. Jung believed that there were 2 sides to the human unconscious mind, the personal and collective. The personal unconscious is the part of your mind where you store things that are unique to you, things like memories, routines, and the like. The collective unconscious is the part of our mind that links us to all other human beings. It is what gifts human beings and all other living things with the mental and physical contents they require at birth, things like instincts. The common example I always use is the instinct to breastfeed. Babies do not learn how to breastfeed. They are biologically programmed to do it following their birth. This is an instinct that is common to all human beings. Thus, it is collective. The source of these instincts is this abstract, natural force, which Jung refers to as the collective unconscious. It is from this force that all living things originate, and it is into this force that we will cyclically return. The collective unconscious is also the source of a human being's personal development. It contains all the things that a human being requires in order to become a more refined individual. If a human being is lacking in some regard, say they are morbidly obese or cruel or vain, and they wish to grow out of these behaviors, they will self-reflect. They will try to pull something out of the collective unconscious, something that they lack, in order to become a better person. It is a painful process, but it is necessary for personal growth. Jung envisioned that there was a natural end to this process of personal development, where an individual incorporates everything that they lack from the collective unconscious. When this happens, the person becomes synonymous with another Jungian concept known as the self, a concept that was the sole focus of chapter 4 in my Ion series. The Jungian self is a person's true self. It is the highest version of themselves. It can only be achieved when a person reins in all their negative impulses and traits and makes appropriate moral use of all their positive impulses and traits. Every human being is unconsciously driven towards their own Jungian selves, just as they were unconsciously driven to breastfeed as babies. In order to figure out how to achieve that ultimate goal, people have invented religious symbols and concepts, many of which were also unconsciously produced. In Jung's mind, the greatest symbol of the self was Jesus Christ, given Christianity's status as the world's most embraced religion. Jesus is viewed as the perfect man by Christians and worthy of emulation. If they can be like Christ, they may achieve their own Jungian selves. This concept carries over to other religions as well. The yin-yang symbol is an unconscious variation of Jung's concept. The balance of light and darkness within an individual is identical to the status of the self. The Hindu concept of Atman Brahman is literally what Jung based his concept of the self on. When the Atman, one's soul, becomes identical with Brahman, which means ultimate reality, then the soul is liberated from the shackles of mortality. It transcends it, much like how Jesus transcended mortality through his resurrection. To summarize, the collective unconscious is a universal force of psychic nature, which all human beings are bound to. The self is the apex of personal development, the unity of one's inner light and darkness, where one approaches the status of God-men like Jesus. Now, in regards to Answer to Job, Jung viewed these concepts to be directly related to the psychology of the Christian God. In respect to the collective unconscious, Jungians view God to be indistinguishable from the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious is everything in its totality. So is God. All living things sprang from the collective unconscious, just as Christians view all of the universe to have sprung from God. In the minds of Christians, it is through God that we become higher moral beings. In the minds of Jungians, it is from the collective unconscious that we derive our higher selves. At the end of this process, the Jungian achieves the self, and the Christian perfectly emulates Jesus. And it is through both that we theoretically achieve immortality. To quote John 14:6, "No one comes to the Father except through me." In psychological terms, no one reaches their highest point except through the self. Some of you might have noticed that the concepts of the self and the unconscious have one key similarity. Supposedly, both contain within them everything that we require in order to achieve higher development. I'd like you all to keep this in mind, along with one key difference as noted by Jung. The collective unconscious may contain everything, seeing that it is the source of all life, but it is a disunity, kind of like a box of discarded Lego pieces. By contrast, the self is a unity of everything. If all those Lego pieces came together into a perfect image of beauty, that would be the self. Disunity reflects the nature of the unconscious as well as Jung's conception of God. It is everything, but the contents within do not relate to one another. This is why, to go back to what I said in the last video, God possesses omniscience, but he doesn't use it. His omniscience is scattered, like a bunch of disunified Lego pieces. It is only through a conscious effort that they can be put together. One might suggest that God's incarnation within Jesus, his son, was an attempt at becoming conscious. God couldn't become conscious before Jesus came into being, for he had no mortal body. And as we established in the last video, consciousness only comes from limitation, from pain. To quote Edward Edinger, "The experience of weakness or defeat is a sine qua non for consciousness. You cannot be a conscious being unless you can experience weakness and defeat. I don't believe it's possible for consciousness to develop in immortal creatures, if there be such a thing. But why would God wish to become conscious through Jesus? We'll discuss that more as we progress through this video and the rest of this series. There's another psychological element that I'd like to introduce, namely the desire of the unconscious to be quote-unquote seen. I will quote one of Edinger's citations from Answer to Job, paragraph 574. The character thus revealed fits a personality who can only convince himself that he exists through his relation to an object. Such dependence on the object is absolute when the subject is totally lacking in self-reflection and therefore has no insight into himself. It is as if he existed only by reason of the fact that he has an object which assures him that he is really there. The subject that Jung refers to is God. Specifically, the behavior God displays towards Job. Evidently, God needs Job's loyalty so much that he throws every possible stress test at him just to make sure that that loyalty is true. If we go with the theory that God is the unconscious, God's behavior reflects the nature of our own unconscious contents. For example, if you do something immoral, your conscience tortures you, right? Why does it torture you? It's because you're trying to make that immoral deed unconscious. You're doing everything you can to not confront it. Nonetheless, this deed you're trying to make unconscious demands attention via your conscience. It needs conscious reflection. In the case of God and Job, God does not exist as an entity unless there is a conscious being to validate his existence. However, as God approaches consciousness of himself via his relation to the conscious Job, he struggles with it, just as human beings struggle with confronting their own unconscious. He parades his entire power apparatus before Job in order to avoid becoming conscious. He would prefer to stay in a state of unconsciousness while having human beings validate his presence. But given Job's higher moral status, God cannot help but succumb to self-reflection. God's immoral actions in the book of Job cannot evolve into full consciousness without being routed through a mortal ego to bring that consciousness into realization. In this case, that mortal ego was Job. Paragraph 591. Yahweh sees something in Job which we would not ascribe to him, but to God. That is, an equal power which causes him to bring out his whole power apparatus and parade it before his opponent. Yahweh projects onto Job a skeptic's face, which is hateful to him because it is his own, and which gazes at him with an uncanny and critical eye. He is afraid of it. For only in face of something frightening does one let off a cannonade of references to one's power, cleverness, courage, invincibility, etc. God has become conscious of the wrong he has done to Job. He is no longer the morally just, supreme ruler of the cosmos. He is forever transformed. He is no longer completely unconscious, for he has now become conscious in at least one capacity. The consequences of this event spell dramatic repercussions. If God is to reclaim his original status as the all-knowing, all-powerful, ever-present, and just, he will need to provide a response, an answer to the tragedy he inflicted on Job. That answer is a continual struggle towards consciousness. The conclusion of that struggle will be revealed in due time. But before we can do that, we must examine the events that preceded within Scripture, the events which support Jung's theses. We will begin this process in the next video. Thank you very much for watching. If you like
Okay, so any comments on any of this?
We wanted to do a special class just in this over the summer. And then Bart had to be out of town, so it kind of fell apart. But we're thinking of, trying that again this summer. And it would involve really reading the text, at least Jung's text, and I would say a good copy of.
We have Edinger's book too. So
Yeah. obviously that would be a must, and the story of Job.
So,
I think I would love to do more of that. I would like to comment on what we just heard. I think that trying to understand unconsciousness, or consciousness or unconsciousness, I guess consciousness is hard. Being coming from a human context, we really, and I guess that's what Bruce was saying in the very beginning. We have to forget the self, because otherwise we're filtering it through, the human experience, and it is only human to make God out to be a human character, but that is kind of an egotistical notion, I think. But it's hard. I don't understand what consciousness really is still. I grasp at it, but I don't really fully get it.
The
I understand. Those are good points.
It's a mystery, really.
Yeah. Anybody else? I'm going to start the other video. Unless there's,
So Cheryl, the alternative is to become God.
you cut out, Bud. What was it?
So for Cheryl, the alternative is to become God.
Well, that's quite something. That's probably not a possibility there, bud.
Okay. Okay, here we go. We'll get the next one going. Stop.
We now see God growing out of his unconscious state. The events that transpired in the book of Job have forced God to become conscious in at least one respect. He is responsible for inflicting wholly unnecessary pain on Job. Worse yet, the pain inflicted upon Job calls into question God's status as the supreme judge, as a supposedly moral God. In order to fix this situation, God must provide an answer to Job. But first, God must continue progressing towards greater consciousness. Jung begins to not only detail but prove God's journey towards consciousness, and he does so by quoting scripture. One book in the Bible that was written roughly around the time the book of Job was written was the book of Proverbs. In that book, we are introduced to a feminine spirit, one that supposedly existed before creation. The idea of this feminine spirit can be attributed to Greek influence, which, if an earlier date is assigned to it, reached the Jewish sphere of culture through Asia Minor, and if a later date, through Alexandria, around 300 BC. This is the idea of Sophia. Sophia is the spirit of wisdom. Her name in Greek literally means wisdom. Here are a couple of quotes from the spirit of wisdom in Proverbs. The Lord possessed me in the beginning of his way, before his works of old. I was set up from everlasting, from the beginning, or ever the earth was. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no fountains abounding with water. When he established the heavens, I was there. When he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was by him, as a master workman, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing always before him, rejoicing in his habitable earth, and my delights were with the sons of men. Jung goes on to note several more references to Sophia from the apocryphal books of Ecclesiasticus and the Wisdom of Solomon. He notes that Sophia's function is much like the functions of several other feminine deities and spirits, like the Hebrew Chokmah, the Indian Shakti, the Hindu Maya, and of course, the Gnostic Sophia. As a master workman, she realizes God's thoughts by clothing them in material form. In this way, she is much like the spirit of the Logos, also known as the Word of God. When God spoke into the void at the beginning of time with phrases like, "Let there be light," it was God's thought and uttering of the word light which gave form to light, Following God's instruction, we see Sophia carry out the task. Now, prior to the book of Proverbs, Sophia's existence wasn't known. It is only here that we discover her integral role in the creation of the universe. Her sudden appearance has no official explanation. Nonetheless, Jung offers one potential reason for her to suddenly show up on the biblical scene. Jung believed that following the creation of the universe, God either began to forget Sophia or he never really knew her, which would be in line with God's persistent state of unconsciousness. Just as God forgot his omniscience in the book of Job, there are other aspects to his being that went ignored. One of those things that was so evidently missing in the Job exchange was wisdom, one of the subcategories of omniscience. Job even calls out to wisdom while in his state of suffering. In chapter 28, verse 12, "But where can wisdom be found? Where does understanding dwell?" But why would God forget the spirit of wisdom following the creation of the world? There are a couple of potential reasons for this. If any of you have watched my Ion series, you might notice that Sophia's relation to God is akin to the Anima's relation to a male mind. Jung believed that within every traditionally masculine man, there exists an unconscious feminine side. The conscious masculine side would need to consult with this inner woman so he can become a more developed person, embracing positive traits and suppressing negative traits that are all stereotypically feminine. The same is true for a woman, but her inner man is referred to as the animus. God the Father is not exempt from this general rule. Sophia is God's anima. God's behavior in the Old Testament is in line with the behavior of many men and their animas. Because their unconscious feminine side is difficult to reconcile with their conscious masculine side, they suppress it. Plus, we should not neglect the very obvious fact that any time an unconscious content is brought into consciousness, there is a great deal of pain involved. That's why people don't introspect, generally speaking. Nobody likes to confront their weaknesses and address them because that's usually very difficult. God is no different from the average man in this respect, and thus he suppresses and/or ignores his anima. Another thing that Jung noted to be characteristic of masculine consciousness is the tendency to project the anima. The average man does this whenever they encounter a particularly attractive woman. When this happens, they become painfully self-conscious. If one were to have a healthy relationship with a woman, the man would allow the woman to bring out the feminine side within him, while also making sure that his masculine side doesn't become null and void. This is usually a difficult, lifelong process because, as I said before, it's difficult to bring unconscious contents into consciousness. It's especially difficult because the female is usually as twisted and bent as the man is. She won't always do things that are pleasing to the man or that are conducive to his personal development, and vice versa. Though God had his anima in Sophia, he had no way to become properly conscious of her and the feminine traits she possessed, because he had nobody to project her onto. Not only that, before the advent of creation, God had nothing to project any aspect of himself onto. This goes back to what we said in the last video about the subject-object relation. God needs mankind, the object, in order to assure he, the subject, exists. The object needs to stare back at the subject and vice versa. Otherwise, neither's existence can be assured. By interacting with the object, the subject can begin to know itself. But if God were to become properly conscious, he would need to somehow project his anima onto something. It is Jung's belief that the people of Israel served this role. Thus, God favored his relationship with the people of Israel over his relationship with Sophia/wisdom. This makes sense because a relationship with one's inner anima would be vastly more painful than it would be to have a relationship with something he created, and that was of a lower status, and would likely be more willing to accede to his wishes. However, it was not as easy as God expected, for the people of Israel continued to disobey him, never doing what he wished. As a result, God was prone to fits of rage, which Jung likened to that of a husband jealously watching over his spouse, making sure she was faithful. This continuous struggle towards consciousness began with the people of Israel and ended with Job, who served as a sort of individual representative for the Israelis. Though Job was a man, he nonetheless fulfilled the feminine role. It was when God projected his own tendency to unfaithfulness and sin onto Job, what with his forgetting of Sophia and his behavior in the Old Testament, that God was finally able to become conscious of the things he lacked. As a masculine deity, he became conscious of the feminine traits that he so desperately needed, and that were so non-apparent in the book of Job. One of these traits was what Jung refers to as eros. The definition of eros is relationship to values, a trait that Jung designates as feminine and that God the Father lacks. Prior to Sophia's reappearance, God's relationship with the people of Israel was an essentially masculine affair, something like the founding of the Greek poli or polis, which occurred around the same time. This relationship lacked eros, and instead was fostered on the basis of its masculine opposite, unrelatedness. Relatedness and unrelatedness are neutral values. They are neither good nor bad, but they are, in Jung's mind, designated as masculine and feminine. In order to understand their moral neutrality, it would be better to understand these two values as completeness and perfection. Perfection seeks exclusion, which necessarily makes it incomplete, thus making it unrelated to some things. Completeness, by contrast, cannot be perfect because it contains everything. God's relationship with Israel was a quote-unquote masculine affair because he was demanding perfect obedience from them. As I said before, when the Israelis did not do as God wished, they were subjected to punishment, as we clearly see in the case of Job. Job sought deliverance from God's impossible standard, from his masculine focus on perfection. Job wished for God to discover the eros, the relatedness that he lacked, so Job's suffering may cease. God needed to understand that he could not use humans simply as tools to further his goal for self-knowledge. God needed to develop a proper relationship, one that included relatedness, if he were to bring the chosen people closer to him. Unfortunately, God could only rediscover this feminine value by projecting his anima onto the Israelis and by proxy onto Job. And so, with the anima projected onto Job, the anima could stare right back at God, like an attractive female stares in judgment at an unworthy man. Seeing that Job was steadfast and righteous during his meeting with the Almighty, God could not pass Job off as a lesser being. Job maintained his righteousness in the face of unspeakable pain and relentless agony, which made him slightly greater than God, if only in this respect. Seeing that the anima's role is to make the masculine mind conscious of what it lacks, Job did the same for God. God remembered Sophia, his eternal consort, and her role in helping him to create the world. And so, God sought out Sophia. He sought out wisdom in order to repair the damage he had done to Job. This reparation would take two forms. On the one hand, God would go from being the infamously vengeful God of the Old Testament into the loving God of the New Testament, a value he regained from his newfound relationship with Sophia. The second form of reparation would be a new creation. Once again, God would use Sophia's power to transform God's thoughts into material form. This new creation would be their literal progeny, a divine child born of God the Father and Wisdom the Mother, a man who would become the physical embodiment of Sophia's world-creating power, the physical personification of the divine Logos, a man whose identity was synonymous with the Word of God. I think we all know who this child is. Thank you very much for watching.
Okay, now I actually have one more. You can see that this particular person, Jordan Peterson, is very much into Jung and his psychoanalytics But I just want to give you a totally different take on the whole thing here, and then we'll try and open it up to discussion. So this is a little much more based on logical reasoning. Let me just
It's God
put it that
coming
way.
and saying, I'm sorry to Job,
Hold on,
saying, you're right. This was a mistake.
I have to start it and crank it up.
Now, there's something I wanted to get your opinion about, which is something of a debate in psychology, especially in Jungian psychology, is to whether consciousness, and so I sort of see consciousness as a reflection of the divine. Like our consciousness is something higher than sort of the unconscious instinctual human. But again, consciousness comes at this cost of, it's very similar to the cost that we see in the Genesis story, where eating the apple causes one to leave the Garden of Paradise. And so I was wondering what you thought. Is consciousness necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, or is it more complicated than that?
Is consciousness a good thing or bad thing? Let me first answer to the answer to Job. So Jung's book, The Answer to Job, which is a very, very fascinating, heretical, subversive, Gnostic reading of the biblical book. The way I understood the book was a bit different, and this might actually answer both questions. Jung sees God in the book as almost being too pure and remove an abstract from reality, that God doesn't truly understand Job and Job's suffering. And Jung opens up a whole new layer to the book, which is just genius. Whereas the book has been read for thousands of years as God testing Job and Job not understanding God, and then God coming in the big whirlpool and saying, I created the behemoth, I created the Leviathan, I laid out the heavens and earth. Like, where were you when that happened? Jung flips the story and he says that it's the suffering of Job that God doesn't understand. That God, being high and mighty up in heaven, doesn't know what it's like to be down here in reality, doesn't know what it's like to feel pain and feel love and feel bliss and feel anguish, feel loss. And that God in some way is jealous of Job, who represents the human's knowledge of what real manifestation and real lived experience is. And this is my reading of the book, and I could be wrong, and it's been a while since I read the book, but it struck me that the genius of Jung was that Jung is creating a paradigm to question the very act of creation itself. So the very act of creation is God leaving the unconscious realm to come into manifest consciousness, which is the transition from God to man, God to Job. So essentially, the act of creating Job, the act of testing Job on the cosmic narrative, like on the upper narrative, is in other words the act of God coming into manifestation to experience pain himself. Right? This might be. Tell me if this is a bit much, but what's happening here is that we've been speaking this whole time about. We've been using two very different theological notions. We've been talking about God is other and separate from the human, and then God is non-dual and one with the human. So the orthodox and mystical, let's call it. And what Jung does is Jung takes those and he twists them in a beautiful way. So we have this discussion between God and Job, but because it has to be non-dual, it's discussion between God and God. It's discussion between God as unmanifest and God as manifest. God is as above suffering and birth and death and life and love and everything, and God as us, as experiencing all those things as God is now, because creation happened. And Job, God in creation, is questioning himself, the pre-creation God. Why did you do this? Do you really think this was a good idea to create creation? Do you really think that all of this suffering was worth it? Do you think, which is your question, do you think consciousness is good? Does this look like a good move to you, God? Look how messed up humanity is. They're killing one another. They're starving to death. There's sort of indescribable and infinite pain And this is the craziest part of Jung's reading. When God comes to Job and says, "Where were you when I laid the heavens and earth? Where were you?" God's saying to God, "You don't know what it was like to be me pre-creation. You don't know how empty and how lonely and how sad that existence, that reality was." And whereas it's typically read as God showing his superior knowledge and wisdom, in Jung's reading, it's God coming and saying, "I'm sorry" to Job, saying, "You're right. This was a mistake. I should not have put you into the suffering. I should not have afflicted you with the boils of reality. I shouldn't have made creation. I shouldn't have brought you into being, into existence. I shouldn't have done this to myself." And he kind of covers behind this veil of omniscience and be like, "Oh, you don't know, you didn't see, you weren't there." But really, between the lines, he's saying, "Yeah, I messed up." And then after that, the end of the book, which most people don't even realize, I need to reread Jung's book because I don't know if this is my own imagination or if this is what Jung says, but when the story ends with Job being re-blessed with double the children and re-blessed with his wealth and with his family and with his life and with his wife again, and then it comes to praise God and thank God, it's a moment which is God as created, God as manifest, turning back to himself, to the unmanifest God, to the unconscious, and saying, "You know what, actually, maybe because I'm able now to experience love and union and children and family and friends, maybe that suffering was worth it. And maybe you're right after all. Maybe it was a good thing. Maybe consciousness is good after all." It's just, it's a tremendous, it's just a wow. One can get lost for years.
Yeah,
on that idea.
that was a really beautiful way to put it. I really like the idea, especially of God having a conversation with himself, because that's kind of what is happening in a sense. That was a really great conversation. I really learned a lot. I feel almost like enlightened from what I learned. So thank you so much.
Okay, so there you have a little different take on all of this, and you can see, again, there's much more to be mined out of this, but I just wanted to get things going with our discussion on Jung. Any comments from anybody?
The big problem I have with it, it's all concepts based on more concepts and more concepts, opposed to where you see it in your own reality or your own mind. Like,
Well, Bruce, you don't think that Jung's notion of self is a drive toward enlightenment, toward non-duality?
Well, it's a great concept, but that isn't what happens.
Right. Okay.
You know.
No, you have a good point. It is, very abstract.
Yeah. It's kind of analyzing with something without real awareness. Like, I mean, real awareness is where you understand things sort of directly.
Right.
It's just,
No, it's a good point.
That's actually what my Kabbalah teacher would say too. He would say Jung's real flaw was that he was not a practitioner.
He was not what?
A practitioner.
Yeah.
He didn't practice. He didn't do it.
It's what they say about the faculty at the Harvard Business School, that they talk a great game about business, but they can't run a lemonade stand.
Yeah, I understand that. That sounds good. See, the thing is when you do a lot of practice and you really get into the deeper mind, there's a whole lot of things there to discover and understand. It's awesome stuff. And these guys are talking away about something that's so abstract, and I kind of lose it. What do you do? Where do you get that kind of idea? My God, what are you doing? Kind of like that.
I would like to just add that for me, this thing of totally anthropomorphizing God is a bit much. That if God exists, I would doubt that there would be this thought process that we're discussing here. I would think there would be something far elevated beyond that, that we learn to go through those processes. I wouldn't think those would be God's processes if God is out there.
Okay.
So I thought it was great.
Sometimes,
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Bud.
Go ahead, Cheryl.
No, Bud, you go ahead.
go ahead, bud.
I thought it was great. This is, to me, this is all based on the concept of grace. And as a person in recovery, I find it, the beginning of recovery is the first step. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And that is a gift. Without that, we can't get the rest of the program. For people, for alcoholics and addicts, we have this program laid out for us that teaches how to live life on life's terms, because we certainly didn't have that before we found the programs, before we found the 12 steps. But we from what I've learned is there's three ways. There's the way of the monk, the way of the fakir, and the way of the yogi. And this is one way. It's not the only way. And it's trying to put in, and Joseph Campbell explains it perfectly in The Power of Myth, because we're trying to talk about things, and I don't see any argument between the Bible and physics, theoretical physics. It's just a way of talking about it, trying to talk about it in terms that that human beings can understand, trying to talk about things that we can't understand. And Emerson talks about the difference between reason and understanding, which I think is saying the same thing, because there's things that we can know logically by reason, and there's things that we can understand without being able to explain them.
It's true.
Cheryl?
It always, when I think so much of the concept of God, I feel like the Wizard of Oz figured it out pretty well. It's this thing behind the curtain, that we can't see, but we can experience, and yet we try to go back there, and then, I guess the thing is that aren't we disappointed when we find out it's a man? So that sort of tells us something, actually, that, we do have an expectation that the notion of God is something not man-made, man-like, it's not a human being. And, when Oz was found to be human, we were sort of disappointed.
Mm-hmm.
I love seeing these images from those are William Blake's paintings, the ones that look kind of drippy, like watercolors there, and just that people have been trying to evoke these concepts with metaphors for so long. I don't think anybody who wrote any of these stories, or anybody who does this music, Wagner, is talking literally. I think they're trying to give us metaphorical stories of what the relationships might be. And if you're interested in this mystery, how you might examine it, and how you might even experience it. I think some of us are driven with these questions and some of us aren't.
And some people get, very happy with whatever they conceived of at some point, and that's enough for them.
Right.
They're like, I gotta figure it out. I don't need to know anymore. And there's something to be said for that in some levels too.
Right. I would say if you can do that, God bless you. So
Yeah, exactly. It's pretty miraculous.
and Jung would say when people came to him for analysis, his first step would be to try to send them back to their childhood religion. If they could do that, he thought that would actually be the best healing that you could have, if you can find some relationship with it. And then if you can't, he was like, okay, very well, then we'll do the analysis. But he saw himself really as a spiritual healer. That's really what his work was meant to do. It wasn't just, a vanity thing. It was, for some people just have to address these questions for their own healing.
I found it so profound looking at those images that his students painted, and I would love to know more about how that happened, because that was so remarkable. Without understanding, like, did they have any images, or did those all strictly come out of each of their minds? And the fact that they were so vivid or so saturated, the colors were so saturated. So I don't know if that was that the publisher pumped up the color to make them look, more vivid, or if that was really truly how they are. But I found that a fascinating process that he was able to get out with people. I would think that would have been mind-blowing for them, because I would imagine many of them had never drawn anything. Maybe not. I don't know.
That's true, especially with like the mandalas.
That was pretty remarkable.
Yeah. And they had no exposure to Eastern concepts or anything like that. They were really tapping into their collective unconscious and pulling those universal kinds of images out, not knowing any of the, to use the word in the Joseph Campbell sense, the mythology, which are really truth stories, I would say. But they were spontaneously painting those paintings. And
They teach that at what's the school in Providence? The
Rhode Island School of Design?
No, the one in Newport, the Catholic school, graduate school, but there's expressionist art.
Right. Yeah, I've been there. I don't remember the name. Yeah.
Is it Salvi Regina?
Yes. Yeah. That's
what I was gonna say.
Yeah.
Bruce, can I ask you a
the
question? Go ahead, bud.
The other thing I forgot was I started with grace, and Christianity is the only way that I know of where you can immediately attain a state of grace. All the other paths require a lifelong practice.
Except Christianity has mortal sins, and venial sins.
But blasphemy is the only unforgivable one, and sin is just a violation of the physical laws or God's laws or the laws of the universe, however you want to say that.
I read somewhere, I forget who said it, that it's a state of separation. That made sense to me. It's a state of alienation or separation.
We cut off Steve. What did you want to say, Steve?
I wanted to ask Bruce a question regarding what you were speaking about earlier. There's something you said that I found thoroughly counterintuitive, which is you were speaking about anger towards God, or I think you said religious individuals, and anger just seems like the last thing I would expect as one attains a loftier state of mind. I wouldn't think that anger would be an emotion that would be elicited through that process.
Well, the thing is that realization can take many years. And what happens, in a sense, being angry is like an old habit. But when realization of no self or non-duality unfolds slowly, it's an extremely complex unfoldment of the mind. So it's all kinds of things can happen. But if you actually see and relate to the mind, you can actually intuit what it really means. It's as I said, I didn't go through that phase because I didn't really believe in God when I was a kid. I never kind of figured it out, so I just left it.
Right. You never had the anger.
So yeah, but well, I didn't have a reason to be angry about God because I didn't believe it was really there. But the thing is when you have you believe that there's another figure that is superior to you, that is not something you experience directly. The mind can create all kinds of ideas about it that are not realistic at all. But I mean, in a sense, when you're talking about all these concepts of God, like it's kind of weird for me because none of it makes sense because there's no God in the first place. So when you have unfoldment of the mind, it is a very one step at a time. So the mind clarifies itself from a deeper level of its own reality. So it's extremely complex. So you don't really have the full-blown non-duality until it's refined. And my own experience of experiencing no self is I didn't notice it right away. Like I didn't realize that's what had happened. I only started to realize it when I started having some major experiences. So the mind is very deep, has deep levels to it that are unusual and hard to find. And when they do arise, they're all very spontaneous. In the meantime, you're dealing with all these layers of conditioned mind, which is very slow. And the deeper mind already knows how to do it really well, but then you still have to experience it. And then a lot of these concepts and understandings that you thought were real actually just simply disappear. It's not that you actually conceptually transcend anything. It doesn't happen that way at all. It just comes from a deeper part of your mind, and the negatives simply disappear. So it's really complex unfoldment.
It's sounding sort of like the anger is part of a cleansing mechanism. I would be curious as to whether after feeling that anger, that it would kind of dissipate and dissolve away, as part of that process.
Well, actually, I'm talking about experience. I heard from somebody else who actually experienced it himself. And what happened when the anger arose, he had a major insight into the nature of the, I didn't find out exactly, but the nature of what really was there. So in a sense, the anger was part of an insight process. It unfolded very quickly into a real deeper understanding. And of course, at that point, the anger no longer existed. He had an understanding basically of a deeper level of non-duality he didn't understand before. So it's insight arising spontaneously is very well designed, but you don't really follow it until you kind of figure it out after. So it's a very extremely complex unfoldment, but then part of your mind has certainty about it. You actually understand, but part of the mind really understands what's happening, and it unfolds for you, and you find out how those things really work. It's more like that. The deeper mind is extremely intelligent, and it understands itself perfectly. And then you kind of like go through a process of finding out about that. And it's really complex. But at the same time, part of the mind has certainty about it. You absolutely trust your own deeper mind. It's very vivid, lots of clarity, and the mind is very certain about it. It's kind of, it comes from such a deeper place that has that reality already. So in a sense, you never end up figuring it out, because it's also a whole lot deeper than you're experiencing so far. So that's kind of the path of awareness of your own mind and understanding the levels of reality that are already in your own mind. Now, going off into concepts is kind of strange for me. It doesn't work anyway. So
Thank you.
It's like peeling an onion.
exactly.
Yeah.
And the thing is as you peel one layer off another, everything changes. Like you realize that there's something really different going on. It's a lot deeper, but it's something you didn't have before you took the layer of onion off. The unfoldment is that way. Huh?
It's smelly and it makes you cry.
Yeah. Okay.
Did you have anything that we don't want? You're not on the spot. You don't need to say anything.
No, my conception is that we are dual people. If we're made in the image of God, we have all those energies, positive and negative. We have to learn how to control them to the best of everybody. And I can understand with Bruce right now, because I am going through an anger period. I get angry at everything, and it's why? What is the reason? I mean, I have to figure it out in myself. Why am I getting angry at things that I really shouldn't be, but they're hitting some kind of button within me? You know, we have to figure it out. And I look at the infinite is in everything, and I have to find it in me and use it to my best ability. That's,
Too much pandemic.
yes.
Well, in terms of my experience and understanding, is that you're dealing with a formation of the mind that came from the past, and it's not working for you properly because the original creation of that formation in the mind, which is like a defense mechanism, like anger is usually a type of defense. But you don't know what that is yet because it was something that happened a long time ago.
Okay.
So your own intelligence is struggling with it, and it'll unfold, but it'll probably unfold in the way that you don't really know about yet. But the deeper mind has that kind of intelligence to resolve that, especially when the motivation is to do that. So realistically, you've been around for thousands of lifetimes.
Right.
So part of you already knows what's real, but difficult trauma, a very difficult condition that you experienced caused you to go into a defense mechanism. And of course, the problem now is that the defense mechanism is dysfunctional. It doesn't work because it doesn't fit, that sort of thing. That's kind of my overview.
So,
Oh, go ahead.
Judith, yeah, so if, I love Alcoholics Anonymous because we can make fun out of just about anything, and people talk about, trying to find God. Well, God isn't lost. But God needs, in the prayer of Mary, God needs an invitation to come in, the still, small, quiet voice of God. So if we, in our unconscious self, are part of the continuum, then we are God. So getting mad at God is you're just getting mad at yourself. So the thing to do is just relax and take it easy and let it happen, because there's no sense in getting mad at yourself if you're God.
Well, the deeper levels of the mind have that reality already. That's how I look at it. Whether you call it God or not is something else. But the reality is that you have that already. And the thing is, when it arises as an insight, you have a kind of a non-verbal understanding that is very different and really doesn't have that much to do with the concept. So it's a different understanding of the unfoldment of the mind. That's kind of how I look at it, or experience it, actually.
But the thing to do is keep peeling the onion.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Steve got cut off. Go ahead.
Judith, I would just offer a more practical approach that has really helped me. I really think that an enormous amount of anger is simply based on unrealistically high expectations of ourselves or others. And as soon as we're able to lower our expectations down to reality, the anger dissipates or goes away.
Right.
Yeah.
And I am trying to realize that when I do get angry, and if it is at another person, I'm seeing myself in that person. And then it's, I have to work on myself to not be that way. That's what I'm trying to do.
Try to practice empathy and self-empathy, and that goes a long way as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Okay, I'm looking at the time, so let's call it quits. We'll reconvene next week. Much more to do on Carl Jung, and we'll see what we can uncover there.
Good discussion, folks.
Yeah, thank you very much. Have a great weekend, and we'll
Thank you.
catch everybody.
Us too.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks,
Thanks.
Bart and Marjorie. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.